Hello again, welcome back to World War II TV. Before I get any further, I want to hope that sound is okay. So I'm looking for the comments now. Are you hearing me loud and clear? Anyone? I want to know if we're working. Are we better? Are we seeing? So everyone understand? Great Dominions is much better. Hearing you perfectly, brilliant. I will bring Steve back in. So, if you didn't see the earlier version, this is our second attempt at this. We started a show, and for some reason, the audio and sound was awful, but it seems to be better again now. So, phew, I'll bring Steve back in. So let's pretend that never happened, Steve. Let's pretend we didn't have that earlier thing. So we were talking about the fact you were a biographer. You've written books about Mickey Marcus, General Rose, and now General Bradley, and what you bring to the table as a biographer rather than a historian. So we'll take that question again.
Great. Let me just correct one thing. I'm working on the book on Mickey Marcus. So,
okay, we're working on that book. Okay.
Well, as we were saying, I'm a storyteller, and I'm telling Bradley's story. That's my perspective. It's not entirely admiring at all phases, but there has to be a certain sympathy with a character that you're pursuing, or there have to be professional and personal reasons for pursuing a particular subject. So that's how I come to it. I also come to it with the personal details of my background, my career, which was heavily involved in research, specifically research of technology companies, but that involved careful consideration of their management, their strategy, the environment in which they operated, and so on. So that was actually very good preparation for what I decided to do as my legacy work, military biography. Of course, that required mastering at least the amount of military history that's required to discuss any one particular individual, particularly someone with as broad an experience as Bradley, who in effect served from the very beginning of America's involvement in the war in Europe and in North Africa, specifically the Mediterranean, all the way through VE Day in a succession of commands. So that was more than the usual amount of military history that one might expect to encounter. On the other hand, it was from boyhood a pursuit that I aggressively maintained interest in through my whole life. And when I had the leisure and the opportunity and the good fortune, and we'll talk about that again too, good fortune, particularly in meeting others in the community, both academic and soldiers and outsiders and every type of individual. That also turned out to be crucial. So that's how I come at it.
Brilliant. Well, for those who didn't, if you're assuming you didn't see the bit of the earlier show where the audio was bad, Stephen is the author of this book here, Omar Nelson Bradley, and America's GI General, and that's what we're going to be kind of formulating our presentation from. Lots of slides today. We'll take questions as we go through. I mean, it's already come up in the sidebar that some, he's not quite as Marmite as a general as someone like Patton and Montgomery, but there are some people who admire Bradley, some who are less enamored with him. But we're interested today in your take on this, Steve, and we'll move through it. So just tell me when to move on with slides, and over to you, Steve, and questions from viewers when they come in.
Okay, let's launch right into it with the first slide. I'm going to talk briefly about the man himself, his background, his career, particularly Cobra. We'll zero in on that, as well as a brief post-war summary, because I think a lot of what we might describe as the legacy of Bradley really does come after World War II. And that presents a real problem for a World War II biographer. We can talk about that later as well. Finally, lessons, legacy, and questions. Not just lessons out of a can, but things that I took away from my study of Bradley, his environment, and the problems he was up against. So the man himself. Slide.
Yep, sorry.
Well, maybe we just pause a bit and address the question of why even write a biography of Bradley. People who have seen his two memoirs, Soldier's Story, General's Life, might think that that was about it. And in many ways, Bradley was a figure who didn't receive critical attention. My path to it, though, really stems through a titan of military history, Martin Blumenson, one of the last official military historians alive when that is American official military historians. We can talk about that as well, who was still alive when I started out. And I approached him, and I had a good backstory. When the original Green Books came out and they were made available, that is the official history, my dad bought me Breakout and Pursuit, which is exactly what we're going to be discussing, which was authored by Martin Blumenson. When I began this work, specifically with Maurice Rose, I contacted Blumenson, and I think it's fair to say we became good friends. He had always been my teacher, but he became my mentor. And more than that, he saved me from the disastrous mistakes that an outsider can make when they start out. Seemingly not that significant things like nomenclature and the particular way to describe units and actions. And that was actually crucial. His advice after Maurice Rose, which I hope we'll talk about some other time, but which was a personal interest of mine, was that I should move on and increase the range of what I was doing. Initially, he suggested Lightning Joe Collins. At that time, there wasn't really a good external biography, although Collins' memoir is really brilliant. Also, there was no real critical biography of Bradley. There were rewrites of what he had done and people who talked about him at length in biographies of Patton and Eisenhower, or buddy biographies like my good friend John Jordan did of the relationship between Bradley and Patton and Eisenhower and so on, but no extended critical, and by critical I don't mean negative, I mean analytic, thorough, layered, and so on. And he thought I could do that. I have to admit, I had trepidations at first. I wasn't that warm to the idea. I had a lot of the prejudices that other people had about Bradley. I was basically uninformed about how deep his career was. But still, I didn't quite commit totally. I didn't think I would have that much original to say. Another good mentor, teacher, acquaintance, Michael Nyberg, says there's three reasons for writing a book. One is you have something absolutely revolutionary to say. Two is you think you can add substantively to the debate. And three is somebody pays you a lot of money. I didn't think that I had really any of those things until I stumbled on an individual at the Imperial War Museum. And there's also a personal backstory to that. My daughter married an Englishman. So I spend a lot of time in London, and I was working on something else at the Imperial War Museum. And I stumbled on the work that Nigel Hamilton had done in his monumental biography of Montgomery about the liaisons at Montgomery's headquarters, and specifically Major Thomas Bigland, a hero of Tobruk, who was in fact Montgomery's liaison officer to Omar Bradley, first at 1st Army and then at 12th Army Group. Bigland wrote letters incessantly to his wife. He also documented the war with a Leica camera, and he kept a journal upon which he based his self-published memoir, Bigland's War. Now, Hamilton basically concentrated on Bigland's eyewitness testimony and observations during the Bulge, but I took it deeper. From the time that Bigland first showed up at Bradley's headquarters in mid-May, all the way through the war, with specific attention to Cobra and other key periods. That was my critical advantage, and I think that had a lot to do with the excellent critical reception of the book. Finally, I had a 2-book deal with the University of Missouri Press, this and Mickey Marcus, so I was committed.
Right, and I think it's worth mentioning, but we'll move on the slides. Way is that when people debate the various abilities and skills and operations of your Pattons and your Montgomerys and your Bradleys, is that there's a staff of people around these people. These decisions that they're making, of course, they have the ultimate say over things, but there's always this team of people around them, and whether they appointed them themselves and what type of people they appoint, and you could spend days talking about the kind of staff that Montgomery establishes and creates, but. I think it's worth referencing that none of the decisions made by someone like Bradley were made completely within isolation. They are with these people who are giving them information. It's like the CEO of a business with all their managers in there saying, here's this situation, here's this set of data. So I think, we tend to forget that there are staffs involved in these systems. Anyway, let's go back to to Bradley's life.
I don't want to leave that because you're going to see, you're almost reading my mind here. You're going to see further on slides specifically about the staff and how that plays into the story, not just as witnesses, but as actors. And just the final ribbon on what I was saying about Blumenson. For a long time, he thought I should write about Beadle Smith or other great staff officers who are overlooked as key players. So I see somebody is asking about William Keene, who was Bradley's chief of staff at First Army and stayed at First Army. But we'll have a lot more to say about that because I think some of Bradley's riskier decisions were about keeping staff, particularly after Kasserine. We'll revisit that. Back to the man, though. Bradley was born in 1893 in the middle of Missouri in what was then and still referred to as Little Dixie, close to Arkansas. He had, here you see him with his father, John, who he adored, and his mother, Bessie, who he had, I think, more distant feelings about. Dirt poor, except for holidays, and in the winter, he went barefoot. They couldn't afford a mule or a bicycle and walked everywhere. He rarely left Jefferson County until he actually went to West Point. So there's a class element in here that I think actually reverberates in his personality and may have had something to do with his visceral reaction to Patton and everything he stood for and all his external manifestations that reflected his class distinction. This is not me opining, but the work of, again, great friends and mentors like Carlo D'Este, who delved deep into his personality. So I think that's a factor. So he grew up with the skills that later became legendary, hunting, fishing, and shooting, as absolute requirements for life. In 1908, his world came crumbling down when his father, who he adored, a kind of a prairie populist, in fact, the name Omer, not Omar, not a Persian poet, but Omer, was a respectable Missouri name and was John Bradley's very good friend, a publisher of a prairie newspaper. Nelson, the name of the family doctor. And here you see the gangly, kind of uncomfortable looking character that in many ways he was. Softened somewhat by Mary. The Bradleys had just moved to Moberly, which was a much larger city. It had an active church, it had a central high school, and so on. So this was a turning point for him. Next. He graduated in 1910 and spent a year working on the Wabash Railroad. And in one of the first great human resources benefits, they gave him a free railway ticket and the day off to go to compete for the entrance exam into West Point. Now, this is also a serendipitous event here. Because of a change in the law, each representative was able to appoint, if they hadn't already, another candidate for West Point. And Brad went, he took the test, he came back, but he basically came in second. However, after the initial arrival of all the cadets on July 1st, so-called Julians, Bradley was notified that the first pick had decided not to go. So he hopped on the train and showed up at West Point August 1st and became what was known as an Augustine. Immediate outcast, wasn't involved in any of the initial month-long brutal plebe indoctrination at West Point that shaped their lives. And his only way out, and it was structural, you couldn't rise in academy rank if you were an Augustine. So it was brutal. It was one of those occasions where being second was both a blessing and a nightmare. But what saved him was sports, and particularly baseball. To this day, there are records that are still held by Omar Bradley. In these very famous, but until recently, obscure pictures of this particular baseball team, every member of the team who stayed in the military became a general officer in World War II. There are many famous names in here, not all of which I can recognize by these photos. But men like John Leonard and Leland Hobbs are on this team. Great division commanders who went on to incredible careers, but were all athletes in both team sports.
And I think we forget that Bradley was a sportsman. I mean, it always gets, whenever Patton's career gets thought about, it's always he was a pre-war Olympian, that kind of thing. But I don't think it comes in so often with Bradley that he was a sportsman. That's from my British take of what I've read. But anyway.
I know, I think that's very apt. I'm a college kid, and I just went to a reunion after 50 years, and guys are still talking about great swim meets and the basketball team of 1968. So these things are formative, particularly if you're at the peak. I begin the biography with a vignette about a baseball game that I think is very revealing about Bradley's personality, and I think comes up again. We'll talk about it in Cobra. A certain stubbornness and an unwillingness to make a mistake after he's picked off in a rookie move trying to steal a base in a baseball game. He never forgot it, ever. It came up again and again, and he kept blaming the umpire and the line coach. He never faced up to it. Now, there's the famous British aphorism about the victor at Waterloo being brought up at Eton and Sandhurst and all the rest. But sometimes these are formative experiences that are revelatory. That's the way I saw it. No, Ike and Company F, when finally, after plebe year, Brad was able to assume where he normally would have been, which is Company F. Back then, you were assigned to company by height. And A and F were the tallest men, and they were the flankers, so to speak. So Brad made a friend. I wouldn't call him a great friend. They were very different emotionally and psychologically. Brad was severe. I don't think he ever went on a date. Ike at West Point, Ike was a cut-up. There were a lot of people who were surprised he ever made it through. They were not, he was middle class, although there were elements of his personality and background that were similar to Brad. But it was a strong relationship. They didn't bump into each other that much in the post-World War I Army. But I think that that was important to him. And as we'll see, it was crucial later on.
Yeah.
This is Brad's howitzer page, written by Ike. That's the yearbook. It's divided into sectors, who appointed him, his achievements on the field and in leadership, and then aphorisms, still waters run deep. That's the basic selection by Ike. Some chatter about Company F and how he turned down promotions to stay at the company. And what's interpreted to be a prediction that Bradley would be the first general in the class, that someday everyone will say, oh yes, I knew General Bradley. Indeed, in this class of 1915, look at the proportion of general officers, the number of stars that fell on this class, so-called the class that stars fell on.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Nothing since the class of 1846, with many participants in the American Civil War and after, even came close to this level of achievement in the military field. So Brad graduates and he goes off into the 14th Infantry in the Pacific Northwest. Here you see him in a sort of what you might consider, an uncharacteristic look here with his mustache. At this point, he had already married Mary, although she didn't go out there because weather conditions were so bad. But the chief element here is he never got overseas. He never fought in the Great War. And he was convinced, as was Joe Collins and others who didn't make it over, that was it. Their career was over. There were decorated war heroes, and Eisenhower, by the way, same thing. There were decorated war heroes, wounded war heroes, Mark Clark, George Patton, Courtney Hodges, Distinguished Service Crosses, serious competition. And it basically haunted him all the way through. Next slide, he marched through a series of assignments till he got to be appointed, his first appointment at West Point as a math professor, after serving as an ROTC instructor in South Dakota. He gets there in one of the most important periods in the history of West Point. MacArthur had been there 1 year. We know his legends and story. An unbelievable character, also a graduate of West Point who had suffered considerably from hazing, in particular by one really brutal tactical officer named John Pershing. Deep animosity there. We'll talk about that later. And anyone associated with Pershing, namely Pershing's brilliant chief of staff, George Marshall. MacArthur changed West Point. To this day, some of his changes endure. One of the most important and least resisted was the promotion of intramural sports, not just the sort of higher profile team sports where MacArthur got into some trouble over recruitment, but all kinds of sports, and in particular boxing and wrestling and field hockey and other types of gymnastics in particular. And at the West Point then, in the rebuilt class after the war, the class of 1924, so-called the Thundering Herd, for the sound of the class over the lumber that was brought in to build barracks to expand the Corps, which of course ended almost as soon as it began. And still, one of the main beneficiaries, and a man made by West Point, was Mickey Marcus, the 1923 intercollegiate boxing champion. And that becomes very important later on. Sports is crucial.
And just a question for you, because one of the sticks people use to beat Bradley, and one of the things they use to build him up, is his kind of all-around nature. He's kind of, if you're looking at a negative point of view, he's a all-round master of, good skills, but master of none. But other people use it as a good aspect or a bad. Where's your take on this? Because we've mentioned baseball, boxing, field sports. Is he already becoming kind of competent at lots of things? And do you see that as being a skill or a negative, or both?
I see it again as layered.
Layered, yeah.
I think I think it's fair to say, although the criticism goes hard, and I'm thinking now of Lieutenant General Bulger's work, which I would love to talk about at length, particularly bearing on Rose or not bearing on Rose, but as brilliant work at the division level, that he would agree that if I wanted to pick a word for Bradley, real expertise, it would be infantry.
Right. Okay.
I think that he grew to understand combined arms. We'll talk about this in Cobra when we talk about the air. But I think he was quite limited in certain aspects. And I think it was very hard for him, once he thought he was in charge of the details, to give it up and to realize that there were greater experts in areas that, he didn't have the time, and I would argue shouldn't necessarily become expert in. This is one of the elements about how I approached him. I compare Bradley not to Patton generally, or Eisenhower or Montgomery generally. I compare Patton to Bradley to other corps commanders when he was a corps commander. I compare him to other Army commanders, even in the 2 months of combat, because of all the time he spent before training First Army. And then I compare him to his peers, or I tried to. Montgomery, Devers, Alexander, who is rarely studied, I think.
Yeah, Alexander needs a brand new reappraisal, I think. And we'll move on. But I think comparing them in the right category is something that's always important. When people say they compare Patton and Montgomery, but at different times one is ahead. Well, Montgomery is always ahead of Patton, but we should be comparing these people on a level playing ground, and I think that's not always the case.
And also, before we move on, I mean, it's also absolutely true that it's rare that we're comparing people like Patton and Bradley who are shifting from subordinate to superior. And then
exactly, that's a very unusual situation. Their particular dynamic is this kind of this staggering overtaking approach that they're going. But anyway, back to 1929.
So skipping over a lot of the war, assignments that all these officers had. I know that when we looked at Leslie McNair, there was a lot of discussion of that. And it's crucial. But the real turning point for Bradley was when he got assigned back to the infantry school. He'd gone there as a student, and this again was the heyday of the infantry school, just like Arthur at West Point. Marshall was not the head of Benning, but he was the head of the infantry school. Here you see him with his crucial subordinates. There's Bradley up in the top. Bradley started out in the tactics group under Vinegar Joe Stilwell, a name that I know has come up in these sessions. But he very quickly was transferred to the weapons section, which he led during his time there. That was everything from a 45 automatic up to a company level mortar and everything in between, and their use and their deployment and all the details. Another very interesting man in this photograph is all the way at the extreme right, seated. Edwin Forrest Harding, fascinating character, class of 1909. He was in charge of the 4th Department, publications, and really the intellectual center of Benning at that time. He held seminars. They discussed maneuver campaigns, the few of them in World War I. The intellectual atmosphere was vibrant and stimulating. Junior officers there at the time included Joe Collins, Norm Cota, the assistant division manager at the 29th Infantry Division, worked for Bradley in the weapons division. So once again, and here again, Bradley takes a knock for being a teacher, a school teacher, because he spent so many years in the school as student and instructor. But the fact is that here he was at the center of the intellectual development of the Army, as was Harding. Harding rejuvenated what became known as the Infantry Journal, still a vital professional publication. And he wrote a book called Infantry Fights, I think, which was essentially written for citizen soldiers, not professionals who would be, in fact, called upon to fight the Great War. So this was a seminal group. Marshall, after this, was on the outs because MacArthur became the chief of staff, and he hated anybody who was associated with Pershing. Marshall went off into the backwater until he came back later. Next slide. And that later was when Marshall was skipped over many other general officers by FDR to become chief of staff in the Army at the unbelievable date of September 1st, 1939. He takes command and starts the buildup. Immediately, he brings in his guys. There's the rumor, the almost apocryphal story about George Marshall having a little notebook, actually. Who knows? But he knew the names of people that he wanted. He also had names of people that he didn't want. Some of them were wrong, and there are some famous examples. James Van Fleet, also in the class of 1915, was passed over because There was another Van Fleet who was known as an alcoholic, and Marshall had it in his head that that was Van Fleet. Terrible oversight. Bradley had a lot to do with changing that. Van Fleet went on to an unbelievable military career. But Marshall brought in Bradley first into G1 personnel, and then he became Marshall's secretary. And here you see him as one of the key players. Again, we were talking about staff. G1 personnel, G2 intelligence, G3 operations, G4 logistics, G5 civil affairs and military government. And that's not what I learned about the British staff system. GS1 logistics and so on. He was a key player in what was the most important maneuver before the war. There were a number, but the Louisiana maneuver was really the key. It was this famous picture of him with McNair, and he gained real recognition. As a result, he became the first general officer in his class and was given the assignment at the Infantry School, you see that down below, basically to set up OCS, Officers Candidate School. They knew that they were going to need tens of thousands of lieutenant, second lieutenant, infantry platoon leaders, armor platoon leaders, and so on and so on. My dad was trained as a medical administrative officer in an OCS camp in Barkley, Texas. It was the first time he ever left Brooklyn. They were all over the United States in every branch. Benning was the model. 45,000 officers were trained during the period that Bradley was at Benning. At the same time, his superior and staff officer for Marshall was Courtney Hodges, chief infantry officer. So they were thinking already about who they were going to need to run all these divisions. And of course, they rotated Bradley through too. First, the 82nd, before it was airborne, but when a lot of the officers were there who took it through that, including Matt Ridgway and others. And then a National Guard outfit, the 28th Infantry Division. And it was from that division that Brad drew several very, very important staff members. As I mentioned before, Bill Keene, a kind of very peculiar but very, very professional character, referred to by his men as Captain Bligh. And they knew what the reference meant.
And I'm glad you're bringing in all these other characters that he's rubbing shoulders with and selecting for his own stuff. Because, I mean, it is, so I'll restate my point. A general is not on his own. A general is the staff around them and his ability to delegate and share the workload.
And it leads perfectly into what I hope is the next slide. Yes. So Bradley is now training the 28th Infantry Division. He's actually at amphibious training, which the Army set up various camps to train, not just in the amphibious operations themselves, but close in fighting, what you do when you're in the beachhead as opposed to expanding and so on. At that time, he gets a notice from one of his friends at G1 personnel that he's going to be taking over the 10th Corps. It wasn't just divisions. They were building up a corps structure and an army structure as well. But before he could even get going, he got a call again from G1 that he should pack some clothes. It was very hush-hush. He was going off to see an old friend, and he should pack for the tropical conditions. And it's interesting what you said before about staffs. We've been hinting at it all along. No one is alone. Marshall saw that in the aftermath of Kasserine, right away, the worst disaster in American arms up until, I guess, arguably Bataan, or arguably the surrender of the 106th regiments in the Bulge. This was the blight on American arms all the way through. It haunted the dreams of American officers from Sicily all the way into the landing of Normandy. Marshall saw that Eisenhower was stretched thin, and he sent Bradley as his liaison to Ike to do whatever he could, and also to look into what had happened at Kasserine. And that's what Brad did. He went out. I love this cartoon because it's a Bill Malden cartoon But Malden didn't do any cartoons of Brad during the war. These were commissioned by Life magazine when Brad's first autobiography, Soldier Story, came out. It was serialized in Life magazine. They used to do that a lot. I mean, they do that rarely now. And they commissioned Malden to do this series. And I thought this was great because the caption here is, they sent him out to find out what happened, and he ended up talking to the men. And I think that's true about Bradley. He had an instinctive appreciation of the GI. Now, whether the label itself is just, pure branding, as we might call it now, some cynical reaction to Patton, we'll talk about that later, with the person who I think created this image, is sort of beside the point. He cared about the men around him, specifically his staff. And I have many, many stories about that, including one from Bigland, where Brad sent Bigland back to England to deal with a particular problem and told him to stay an extra day so he could see his family. Now, that resonates with me, and I think resonates with the men around you. The other thing to remember about staffs in general, while we're on the subject, is they're not living in chateaus, living the high life. They're out there working late at night and in the field. Often the forward tactical headquarters of 12th Army Group, as it became formed in Vans, was not, pleasant living, let alone the first headquarters that Bradley set up in Sicily or in Normandy. And they were living in tents under apple orchards, and they were trying to plan the war at the same time. So that's a lousy knock. And also, these guys were in their 40s, and war is a grinding experience for everybody. We should never forget that. Definitely. He makes his report, and he's getting ready to give it to Eisenhower, but he doesn't even get a chance. He gets to Eisenhower's headquarters and is told that Patton's going to take over Second Corps. Shortly thereafter, is portrayed, who knows how, in the movie. Brad is appointed deputy to Patton at Second Corps. I don't think that was actually on the table of organization, but that's in itself interesting. When you're commander, you can do that, and Bradley did that. And later on, I believe Brad did that by appointing a deputy, namely Courtney Hodges, when he was First Army commander, to ease the transition when he left. Now, we'll have a lot of arguments about Courtney Hodges. I don't want to get into it too deep, but it did facilitate that transition. And here we see the payoff. When Patton left in April to go plan the operation in Sicily, he had won the necessary battle at El Qatar. It was, I still think, mostly a morale booster. It brought back, after Kasserine, the prospect that the Americans could defeat the Germans in a head-on engagement. Yep. There were a lot of limitations on what the Germans were capable of at that time. I think it's certainly true. But I wouldn't want to take away from Patton's achievement, particularly in restoring discipline, although I think that's overplayed. But again, a key decision that Brad made was to keep the essence of the Second Corps staff, particularly Monk Dixon, G2 intelligence, who basically called Kasserine, but Friedendahl, and I got to say, it was the first thing that I wrote as a professional military historian, was an analysis of Lloyd Friedendahl and his brutal failure, published in Army magazine basically because of Blumenson, and the first award I ever won in this field. And I looked at it really, really deep, and Friedendahl made just about every mistake a commander could make. And he left Second Corps in a shambles spread out all over the battlefield. One of the achievements that isn't quite clear in this map is the concentration of Second Corps in that very small area. The British wanted to take apart Second Corps. They thought that Doc Ryder had failed at the 34th Division, even though he was under direct British command, and so on. And they were spread out over the battlefield. As I said, it was Bradley who made a logistics decision to run trucks at night and risk aerial bombardment. The Americans didn't have superiority. They had supremacy, but not superiority. And running those trucks to congregate all four divisions of his corps was a real risk. People forget, and I guess I glossed over this on the West Point slide, Bradley was a gambler. The time that he was at West Point, he had as much as $10,000 in the stock market at any one time. Think about that. The pay for a major in the American Army at that time was something like $120 a month. And Bradley was dirt poor. He was a heavy-duty stock market gambler. Never forget that.
And hold that thought, because when Cobra comes up, which it will do later on, you know, Cobra is a big risk. It seems post-event that it was destined to succeed because the German army is about to break, blah blah blah, and we'll get to that later on. But you know, when we talk about Montgomery being, you know, bold with Arnhem, or Patton being the one taking risks, it's Bradley knows when to you know, put his chips on the table.
I think that's fair. He, like I said, he was a son of a teacher, and he knew how to weigh risk. He became a math teacher, by the way. It's not like he knew that. He taught himself how to do that. He was barely ahead of his students. He was an inveterate crossword puzzle guy. I mean, there was a calculating nature there that I think was, let's say, obscured by the blandness of his outward personality.
Yeah.
As well as a seething temper. We'll talk about that later. And as I intimated, a real resentment that he could nurse a grudge for 50 years, and he did. It's at this period that the Great Partnership developed, and I would call it that. This picture was taken after June 3rd, when Bradley got his third star. So it's after the victory in Tunisia. It's undoubtedly during the planning for Husky, because Patton is still wearing a left shoulder distinctive unit insignia of 1st Armored Corps, which was his outfit through the planning process until the 7th Army was famously born at sea on July 10th. So knowing Patton, there's no way he would have had the wrong distinguished unit insignia on the wrong shoulder when he was entering combat. It would have been on his right shoulder. So that's a bit of timing. And indeed, I think during Sicily, for whatever we may have read or think about the movie and so on, they performed pretty well. Now, we could criticize the plan, or whether there should have even been an invasion of Sicily, what it was for, what it achieved. Patton's mad dash to take Palermo. You can see here that the Germans were not in Palermo. The Italians were in Palermo. He cut off a giant army, and that was great. But the Germans were dug in and eventually retreated along those roads to Messina and essentially escaped. An awful lot of attention is also placed on those amphibious operations to the north. Not that much attention is paid by boosters of Patton to a near disaster that ensued because of tactical considerations, let's say, timing and so on. So it was a mixed affair. It broke the friendship of Patton and Bradley, and I don't mean over the slapping incident. There was just too much friction. Patton, it's true, he was bold and decisive, but he frequently crossed the line of mixing in and issuing orders to subordinates. Now, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it ran against the grain of someone like Bradley. It also is reflected in the relief of command of Terry Allen and his second in command, Roosevelt, because in essence, they were not team players. They did well enough, in fact, so well that they both later came back. Terry Allen in charge of the Timberwolves, 104th, and famously Teddy Roosevelt with his cane on Utah Beach and slated to take over a division. But still, it says something about the personalities involved, particularly since it should have been technically Patton who relieved these guys. But he was sort of like other leaders, political and otherwise, who don't like to do it face to face. And in fact, in one of the more personal reliefs of command by Patton in Africa, he sent Bradley to relieve the head of 1st Armored Division, Orlando Ward, after Ward had been wounded in the eye, leading an attack of the 1st Armored Division for a lack of aggressiveness. But he couldn't do it to his face. He sent one of Ward's best friends, Bradley, to do it. And that pissed off Bradley. These things don't go away. In
So
any
just to underline this, so you're saying that in North Africa and Tunisia, the partnership between Patton and Bradley was pretty sound and solid, but Sicily is kind of where it begins to fall apart.
There were some personal things about when Bradley's staff, Second Corps staff, was also getting ready to plan as part of Cobra, because initially it was going to be the Sixth Corps that was going to go with Patton, but he requested Bradley. So that says something right there. But Patton did stuff like giving a really crappy location for the staff headquarters of Second Corps. There were problems setting up electricity. It was a pain in the neck. Those are things that, in war, you can say, oh, well, it's war. You shouldn't let that aggravate you, but it does. And it was those kinds of things that irritated Bradley. Personal, yes.
Right.
And
okay.
I wouldn't want to make too much of that. I remember Blumenson told me that there are no personal things in war, but I spent my life on Wall Street. I don't believe that.
No, super. So,
so here we have, one of the images of Bradley, and what we talked about before, the GI General label, the Soldier's General. I got to say, I've never actually found the source, but it's universally acknowledged that it was Ernie Pyle. Pyle couldn't stand officers generally. He especially had not that much respect for generals. What's really great about this picture also is he never wore a helmet, ever. But he showed respect here. And this is what happened. He was tipped off by Ike. He said, you should go visit Bradley. He's a secret weapon or something like that. And Pyle did. He spent 3 days at headquarters. He rode around with Alex Stout, who was Bradley's driver. He hung out with the cooks. He talked to his aides. He went out and he saw that Bradley was who I described, a man that men around him really liked and appreciated, cared about soldiers. And he wrote a series on Bradley, the only one that he wrote. And he was the equivalent of a multimedia YouTube broadcaster. Multimedia was a war correspondent. He was syndicated by Scripps in like 150 newspapers. He was the most famous war correspondent in history. So when he said Bradley was a good guy, that mattered. And of course, George Patton played right into that by slapping the soldiers. He undoubtedly would have been named U.S. First Army commander. I don't know whether he would have gotten the parallel appointment, which the next slide leads us right into. Oh, it doesn't. It's actually, it's another reflection on Second Corps. Here they all are. There's Monk Dixon at the end, Bill Keane sitting next to him, Bradley in the middle, and his other officers, the special staff above them. And it's important to remember, for all the criticism that they get later, we'll talk about this briefly, they were the most experienced amphibious experts there in the Army. They, including the Pacific at this point, although we'll touch on that later with one of the key players. But they were feet wet. They had been involved in planning at North Africa. They were in Sicily, and now they were getting ready for Normandy.
And do you think Bradley appreciates the fact that a human being in some ways learns more from things that go wrong than things that go well? And so some of those experiences, Kasserine and then going on to Sicily not being the perfect campaign, your better staff will learn more from those kind of experiences. They will from everything just going brilliantly and from one victory to another victory.
I think that that's true beyond belief, but I think it's also true that no one wants to actually admit that. They don't want to say, I failed, and this is what I learned. And I've seen that so many times. But it's also, again, it's all in the personal details. That first article that I wrote on Friedendahl, the subtitle was Lessons from Failure. You don't do that, you're cooked. And it's also true that the Army does have, and even now has, an institutional culture of after-action reviews. And failures are faced up to, and they're addressed. And I think that, yes, they did. But it's also true that provincialism, narrow-mindedness, and as I said before, success also leads to arrogance. And there are some who think that the Second Army staff, which became the First Army staff, we don't have enough time to describe everything that's involved in that. There was a feeling that they were exactly that. They were narrow-minded. They didn't take expert advice. That may have been a factor in not getting the right tanks ashore on D-Day and so on and so on.
Right,
So,
but we move on to First Army, and
no,
people are saying, "Is it Normandy soon?" Not that they're not enjoying what we're doing; it's just that they're excited about the Normandy bit. I think.
okay.
Yeah.
I forgot when we started late. Okay, well then we'll move on fast. He was appointed First Army and First Army Group at the same time. Here he's actually pictured in London. First Army was in Bristol. Next slide shows his digs. Reason I put this in here is it's within walking distance of my grandkids, and whenever I go to London, I like to pay my respects. You see it here before the battle, after a bombing in March, and as it is now.
Yeah, super.
Next slide. Again, the staff and the key players. The interesting thing here is Bigland and Chet Hansen, his aide. Most people know that that's towards the bottom. Hansen kept an incredible diary beginning in Sicily, but really much heavier when he arrived in Normandy. It's almost day to day. He saw a lot. A lot of my descriptions, a lot of the characters that we've been talking about are based on his work. And below you see the corps commanders, key. What I was saying about provincialism applies to Charles Quatlet, Pete, Cowboy Pete, so to speak. He was an expert in amphibious operations, cut his teeth in the invasion of Kwajalein, leading the 7th Infantry Division. His advice was completely ignored by First Army staff. Bradley considered him a lightweight. Again, pictures about my point of view characters, Bigland to the right. Fascinating. He was awarded the DSO after a stand at Tobruk. He was a staff officer in a horse artillery unit that had been transferred into an anti-tank unit with 6-pounders, I think. Every single member of the troop was killed or wounded. He immediately took command. He was the only one who emerged unscathed. The infantry that were assigned to his outfit marveled at his bravery. He was given the DSO by the hand of the king in the presence of his family.
Wow.
That just rings. Anyway, as I said, I relied on him heavily. This is a very great interest. It's the German intelligence estimate just before the battle. If you look up there at the top, it shows the complete success of the deception plan. There you have First Army Group. At this point, it was all phony radio traffic, and all those little pennants are phony outfits. On the other hand, if you look at their accuracy in the British and American order of battle information, it's staggeringly accurate. Also, it shows what the Americans didn't see down below. That is the deployment of the 352nd Infantry Division, not 5 miles behind Omaha Beach, but dug in right above the bluffs. A mistake that was discovered too soon to have anything to do about it.
And a potential big rabbit hole to go down, but we will do that for an Omaha Beach 352nd show in the future.
Right.
But
this is just again, staff. This is the command of Overlord, and it was truly the first combined joint staff, British subordinates, British commanders and American subordinates, airmen, paratroopers, and so on. A lot to talk about there, but let's move on. Here's our plan for Overlord, or Neptune, actually, the naval aspect here, and the lodgment itself, which I believe ended on June 30th. The plan was basically developed by Cossack, the combined chief of staff, combined Supreme Allied Commander. Bradley supported the addition of extra airdrops, even though that had led to disaster in Sicily. He really believed in it. Trafford Leigh-Mallory hated the idea, said 80% die that day, and so on. This is the plan, and it shows the command structure. Bradley and Dempsey directly under Montgomery, and that would be the play. Overall command, Montgomery, perhaps his greatest achievement. And also the greatest achievement, perhaps Cobra, but I might argue that it was his command of First Army, organizing the army, bringing it to the point of invasion. This moment here where he decided to support the invasion at Omaha Beach, it was very hairy. The role of Chet Hansen and Bill Keane, I describe at length in my book. They showed up in a PT boat just off the coast at the time that the battle was changing, literally. when the men were standing up and moving off the beach and making their way through the exits. He made the call to support the invasion at Omaha instead of delaying it, which would have been a nightmare as it was ongoing, or to ship those forces somewhere else, which just doesn't happen on the fly. Very, very brave.
And now we're getting into the seeds of Cobra, because some of the key players, we talk about Maurice Rose earlier. Ultra is big part of the story because of Cobra and the understanding of what the Germans are up to. So, I know, folks, we are going to get to Cobra, but all this is part of the context, isn't it? So I'll let you explain.
And this is the buildup here. When we talked about failure before, there's a vignette in my book about Lord Mountbatten reporting on what had happened at Dieppe. And he laid it out pretty clear. He said, the first objective is to land, regardless of the weather. And we could talk about that endlessly, the decision to go and so on. The second is to resist the counterattacks of the enemy and to build up enough force to take the next step. And the third step is a counteroffensive out of the beachhead. Everybody knew that within 1 week, the Germans would get their stuff together. Deception plans or no, strategic considerations or no, the Germans were brilliant in counterattack, and particularly in utilization of defensive terrain. More on that later. But now we're talking about marshland. A good number of paratroops who dropped into this area here drowned. This was a nightmare. Carentan was at the seam of the 5th and 7th Corps. At this point, the bridgeheads were connected, but they were frail. And everybody knows you go for the seam. That was the weak spot. And they knew it, but they were doing what they could. It was hard to resupply 7th Corps. The paratroopers were out there hanging on by their fingernails. And that was the situation. Even after the 101st Airborne, and particularly the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which is made famous in Band of Brothers, took and held Carentan on the 12th. But they were picking up indications from Ultra. Now remember, at this point, and through the rest of the war, nobody below Corps level knew about Ultra. The only people at Corps level were those who knew about Ultra before, not after the establishment of special liaison units and the whole infrastructure for communicating and protecting Ultra information. So for a long time, we really had no idea what had happened. In the memoirs, it's all obscured. We got some information, but not how. They used the usual dodges to cover up Ultra. But they knew an attack was coming from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier, supported by the 6th German Parachute Regiment under von der Heide, an incredibly interesting character. I wish, I wasn't good. But anyway, they didn't know exactly where, but just before dawn, they did find that out. And Rose, at the head of CCA, a brigade-sized unit of the 2nd Armored Division, met the Germans head-on in counterattack, stopped it cold, and I think saved the Band of Brothers from what might have been annihilation. He got a lot of credit for that. Everyone took note. It's fair to say that he was a favorite of both Brad and Eisenhower and Joe Collins. More on him later. So they stopped the first major counterattack. It turned out also that Mickey was in Carentan. He finagled a transfer. He was at that point head of planning at G5 in the Pentagon, claiming that it would facilitate stuff. They needed a civil affairs officer right after getting to Europe to see what was happening. Montgomery and his army had liaison civil affairs guys. You see the American unit he was attached to, John McGinnis, on the left was the commander. A lot more about him when we delve into Mickey in another session. But just one thing I got to make clear here. Mickey Marcus, Kirk Douglas did not jump into Normandy. He waded ashore on D+2 with all of these men under air and artillery bombardment, soaking wet, dragging his Springfield 1903 like about 50,000 other people during those days. Heroic, but not jumping out of an airplane. Next slide.
And this is now when because that I want to just bring you back to the fact when we're talking, and I mean we as historians, amateur historians, people who watch World War II TV, and we're talking about the June period in Normandy, we're always talking about it through the lens of what is Montgomery planning. Montgomery should be doing this. I'm sure in the chain of command, Montgomery is above, but I don't think we spend enough time thinking about what Bradley is considering during this period. And it is, James Holland refers to it as the attritional phase. You get the invasion, then you get the attritional phase, then you get breakout later on. But during these weeks of, and I know you're talking about this in a second, that kind of stagnation period there, Bradley isn't just twiddling his thumbs. He's bringing together all his expertise, his resources, things like that, planning that next phase. And do you think generally we ignore too much what people like Bradley are doing in this period and put all the focus on Montgomery?
Well, I think it's true that and Bigland had a lot of trouble trying to explain this to the Americans. May sound strange coming from me right now, but the British were up against a lot.
Of course.
The strategy in some ways that led up to Cobra worked. He drew the significant armored forces that were in the theater to him for whatever reason. His attacks in early July, Goodwood and Shortwood and so on, also concentrated armor to, it depends on which way you're looking, but to the east, that is right flank, left flank, and so on. But that's true. It's, I think, also important to note that Bradley's objective was defined by the port of Cherbourg.
Yeah.
And I think that was a miscalculation, fundamentally. Thank God for Mulberry, as long as it lasted. Thank God for bringing stuff over the beaches, because everybody should have realized that the surrender of Cherbourg was not going to be a strategic event. In fact, the work that I did on Marcus, I'm doing now, led me to Lucius Clay, who was brought in November to get the Cherbourg port operating. That also brings us to Brittany and what happened there another time, whether that made any sense, because the complete tonnage, and here we're into the nitty gritty here, the logistics, there wasn't enough even in the Channel ports, assuming they were going to be destroyed, to justify the investment. And I know we're jumping ahead a little here, but when Bradley realized that on August 3rd, he turned Patton around, essentially. So if you look at the map here, you see that he was preoccupied with Cherbourg, cutting the peninsula. That was Joe Collins's assignment, basically, and It took quite a while. It didn't happen until the end of June. Worse than that, though, is the darkness on this map. That's Bocage. And that was a major, major mistake. Now, it's true that it may not have been reflected in the maps, and maybe the engineers didn't know the maps, but it's also true that, there were by this time they were in France. They should have had people who knew about the Bocage. They didn't, and that was a nightmare, as we well know. By July, they hadn't even reached the major, really strategic objective for road junctions, which is Saint Lo, right in the middle here, and just south of the front line. It took pretty much the rest of July to batter their way to take Saint Lo. But even before that, maybe even as early as the first week of July, although the real evidence suggests maybe the second week, Bradley was already thinking about the breakout. He had at one point had a discussion with Montgomery about it, but it was theoretical, and they were still trying to get Cannes and Cherbourg. So by this time, exhaustion, yes. I mean, they had been battering their way. On the other hand, at this point, nearly 1 million men had been landed. At the conquest of Saint Lo, First Army was 4 corps, including Middleton's 8th, which would soon be transferred. Maybe 20 divisions. The buildup of the British at this point had reached their maximum limit. And that's also a political observation. It was also an element of command in Africa and the Mediterranean, because the British dominated still. But now the weight of the war was going to shift, not just materially, but in command decision making to the Americans, and it was inevitable.
Yeah.
So at this point, there was a lot of grumbling in the press. People were wondering about, whether we see it now with Ukraine, whether it had settled into a stalemate. You know what happens when that takes place. People lose interest. And just briefly looking at the contemporary interpretation of military events within broader context, diplomatic situation, the intelligence and information context, economics, people, and particularly the press, were starting to wonder whether this had just bogged down. I don't think anybody thought we would be defeated. I think it was too late for that, but stalemate was definitely possible. And what would that mean politically? If you don't, there's an adage, John Spencer, the modern expert on urban warfare, out in the press a lot now, is fond of saying, not losing is winning. And the Germans were not losing. They were getting weaker, but they were not losing in Normandy. So I think it's fair to say that. Bradley held, this is another Malden cartoon that was commissioned at the time. I actually put this on the back of the book because I think it shows a growing awareness by Bradley of the importance of the press, which he kept at a distance. One very important course, which just another example of Bradley's temper and grudge holding. One very important correspondent, the military correspondent of the New York Times, Hanson Baldwin, went back before this meeting here, and he wrote a scathing review of Bradley's performance. Bradley was livid. 30 years later, somebody referred to it, and Bradley said he thought of himself as a military analyst, but he really wasn't. I mean, that's what was going on. Also, at this time, around July 14th, and if we get into the Cobra plan here, this would probably be good timing. Maybe we'll skip over this.
Okay.
This is the masterpiece. To the left was the original plan. There was no real breakout anticipated, not the way we see it in the diagram on the right. And we'll talk about that right now. As you said, Cobra was a complex, many-layered operation. I spent a lot of time in my book looking at the air component specifically, because it was revelatory about Bradley's personality and what happened. But it's also a key element of the complexity. And I don't just mean the size of the operation, bulking together 6 divisions. Normally that would be 2 corps, a small field army in and of itself. It was more than 100,000 men just in the actual order of battle divisions, let alone the countless regimental, brigade, battalion size attachments. It was gigantic. And that has its own set of problems for both 7th Corps, which had to be stretched, as well as 1st Army. So that needs to be kept into the context here. The air campaign itself, as it developed, was 4 separate phases. A strike by fighter bombers at the edge of the rectangle along the Saint-Pierre Road. A little bit more on that later. Then a strike by then a strike by the 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s of the 8th Air Force, to last 1 hour. Then another strike by the fighter bombers and a concluding strike by the mediums, B-26, B-25s. I may have the order of that off, but it was a 4-stage type of operation. Difficult to coordinate, particularly since the fighter bombers were under the control at that point of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, which had its own problems, while it was carried out by both the 8th Air Force, controlling the heavy bombers, and the 9th Air Force, specifically the 9th Tactical Air Command under Pete Quesada, very interesting character, who were actually conducting the mission. Quesada, by the way, was Maurice Rose's roommate at the Command and General Staff School, and they talked a lot about armor and close air support when they were kids, basically, and now they were putting it into practice. It's also fascinating that Quesada, who was an airman, pitched his tent at Bradley's headquarters. for close coordination between staff, the men who are actually running the war. Now, the masterpiece itself, you see it here on the right, concentration of force, but that's one of the real risks. If you can't actually take the initial objectives and hold open the flanks, Saint Gilles and Marigny assigned to the heavy armored divisions, 2nd Armored on the right, 3rd on the left, CCA at the spearhead and at the front of 2nd Armored, commanded by Maurice Rose. The plan called for the infantry divisions, the 1st, the 9th, and the 30th, to take those 2 objectives. Then the exploitation phase would begin by the heavy armored and the mechanized 1st Infantry Division, now under Clarence Huebner. They would then run and exploit down to Coutances. That was the original idea. They thought it would be grinding across the whole front. The Germans were dug in pretty solid, as you can see on the original map on the left, as to where the front line was. And if they were lucky, they'd make it to Coutances, and then they'd figure out what to do then. So we know what happens, and I'm not going to go over the specific details of the battle because we've heard it from Leslie McNair's biographer and others, and we know it well. After the disastrous bombing, and I, again, examined that in detail, particularly the recriminations that Bradley stoked, frankly. When we think about this bombing mission, it was one of the most successful in history. It cracked open the theater and led to astounding achievement. Yes, 500 men were killed in that second bombing, and it was dreadful. But the technology of the aircraft at the time, the Norden bomb sight, all the rest of it had been laid out at a meeting with Bradley and the rest. I skipped over that slide, but that in itself was a fascinating demonstration of the complexity and the risks and the gambling. Those who were calling the weather for the airstrike were not the people who were actually doing the mission. Fundamental mistake, just insane in many ways.
We talked about it on the show about McNair. I think it came up in the show with Kevin Hemel as well, is that the narrative that we all adhere to is the tragedy of the friendly fire, the 30 division guys who just come down from up, their terrible time crossing the Veer and what have you. And as you say, there are 500 loss of lives lost there. But we don't often focus on what's happening to Fritz Bayerlin's headquarters, just the other side, in the middle of the rectangle that's being bombed. And from the German point of view, that was cataclysmic. That rectangle of bombs.
Let me just close that out on the bombing before I turn to that, because that's the crux of the issue. What was happening on the other side of the hill was what was really important. Bradley couldn't give it up. And I'm talking about almost demanding that Jimmy Doolittle, who the hero of, and I know that you probed this, and James Scott and others, are just brilliant on this. Doolittle was an unbelievable national hero. Bradley wanted to have him fired. That's how bad this was. But just to get back to the reality, and one of the things I learned about fascinating was the Operational Research Service of the 8th Air Force. These were number crunching guys. They took a look at this in depth. This is where my business background as a technology analyst was useful. Only 4% of the bombers missed at all. Given the claims of the Norden bomb sight dropping pickles and barrels, you were lucky if you hit the right county under certain weather conditions, let alone the smoke. And Bradley's overemphasis of the ruler sharp nature of the St. Pierre Road as a marker for a no bomb line, that went out the window as soon as the first bombs dropped, because the smoke was visible in Carentan. It was almost 10 miles away. So the risks were preponderant, but only 1% of, missed, 1% of the bombs and 4% of people died. Yes, it was costly, but when you think about the staggering success of the operation, which we'll turn to, it was successful. And luckily, none of it became public. Marshall and Eisenhower were able to keep Bradley under control, thank God.
Yeah. So, have you got any comments to make before we can talk about the success of the operation, about those first few hours when it is looking a little bit iffy, and second and third armor are, I'm not going to say they're ponderous and the infantry support there, but my take on it is some of these units have been in that kind of nose to nose, hedgerow through hedgerow campaign for the previous few weeks, and suddenly this is a different type of movement now. You're meant to be moving with speed and meant to be moving with kind of aggressiveness, and it would take a while for these units to adapt, to this new change there. But anything you want to say about Bradley's kind of leadership in those first few hours when it looked like it wasn't going to be a success? We know now it was a success and it went beyond what it was supposed to do. But that first day, particularly when it was looking a bit dicey, what was happening there with Bradley?
Well, here again, the staff was desolated. They thought that it was a terrible defeat. The newsmen they didn't know what they were going to do next. Of course, there's usual griping, those guys screwed up, these guys screwed up. But by the end of the day, they had only averaged 1,000-yard penetration. That was a huge disappointment. Some people thought that maybe the Germans had been broken up, but that the size of the bombs had been a problem, which had happened with the British before. Even though the Americans changed to 100-pound fragmentation, and it turned out not to be an issue, that was the scuttlebutt. And you know what rumors are like. Awful. But Joe Collins, most of all, was picking up indications from his units that exactly what you had just described had happened. Bayerland, the Panzer Lehr Division, which had already, by the way, been stripped, to a mere shadow of itself. I think at that point, before the bombing, they had 45 armored vehicles. I mean, that's nothing. So they were pretty shook, but they were still Germans and they were fighting hard. And they were holding this initial penetration, which, as I said, was to only be concluded when the infantrymen took those two towns. So now we're now at dawn on the 26th. Collins makes the crucial decision. He feels that actually the Germans are ready to crack. Now, I've heard that a lot when I worked on 3rd Armored and Rose. In the initial attacks in Normandy that the 3rd Armored made, a lot of them were very, very bloody, as we know, and the 2nd Armored as well. A lot of times guys would say, well, it's a thin crust out there, but it wasn't. At least it looked that way. But Collins made the crucial decision. He committed the armored divisions before the penetration requirements laid out in the plan had been achieved. Now, think about that. Bradley gets a lot of grief for being by the book, the plan, doesn't seize the initiative. Of course, if we were discussing fillets, we'd be talking about that endlessly, or even Mortain. But still, the plan was to wait. Joe Collins said, no, yes, it looks like they're moving ponderously. He was probably thinking Leroy Watson, who was the commander of 3rd Armored, stinks. I need to get rid of him. That happens right after because of a road march that happened during this campaign. Like I said, the original idea was just to take croutons, but Rose this is Blumenson's opinion, what I'm about to give here. Rose's achievement was so great, reaching Villa Dawn in only 2 or 3 days. And my co-author on the Rose biography, Don Marsh, was on that ride. He was at HQ CCA, a wireman attached to Rose's headquarters. He described to me riding at night through the burning village of Cannacy, the most terrifying thing of his life. So they were not afraid to take risks. Night fighting, armored warfare was not that common at that time. And Rose made the dash. In 3 days, he had reached the objectives that they didn't even know they'd achieved. And that opened the way for the real breakout, which we see on the right. They slowed down 2nd and 3rd Armored Division and gave 8th Corps the opportunity to take advantage of the cutoff forces and move down along the coast and pivot, to get ready to pivot on the new front line that opened up the possibility for what we now know as Cobra. But at every stage, it was a gamble. It was a near run thing, as they always are. I don't think we fully appreciate that. nor do we fully appreciate the importance of Montgomery pinning down all the armor. I don't think the Americans appreciate that either.
Well, definitely that yeah, that's something I'm always on about, is ultimately you can't consider Cobra without considering Bluecoat that is happening over on the left flank. It's the follow up, the second punch, but so often American historians talk about Cobra and British ones talk about Bluecoat, and they don't put the two together. But I'm interested in discussing, and we'll bring up the next slide there, the kind of the Patton taking over Third Army, because we talked about earlier about this situation they had, Bradley and Patton, in North Africa, Tunisia, and then Sicily, because there's this. I want to know what your take is on exactly when Patton takes command, because the Third Army, as we know, is activated on 1st of August, but Bradley has kind of pushed Patton down earlier, but is he in an advisory capacity because Middleton is in charge of 8th Corps? And so what's your take in understanding from Bradley's point of view of exactly when does Patton take command of Third Army?
I'm not sure that I can really shed that much light on that. In fact, I didn't really concentrate on that. I figured that Middleton's 8th Corps, which had been there for a while, had done the bulk of the planning with strong input from Patton. After all, he was present. The idea, as it's shown in the movie, that they spontaneously decided that they would, in the trailer, appoint the old cavalryman to lead Third Army once, they were already on the continent of Europe is a complete fantasy. Patton was appointed to his job officially way before then. And I would probably venture to say that he was probably mixing in from a very early point, and that Bradley was probably trying to keep him under control. There is an interesting quote that I just saw in my own book late in July in Patton's diary. Remember, again, Martin Blumenson was also Patton's first official biographer. He was the first one to get a look into Patton's papers, particularly the diary.
Yep.
So I spent a lot of time looking at the Patton papers. And there's an entry in there as late as August or July 19th, I think, saying that Ike and Bradley don't have the faintest idea what they're doing. That suggests to me that he was getting actively involved in the planning, and he didn't particularly like what he saw, although I don't know specifically. So I think the real issues come about after what's represented on this sort of, this is a great unit diagram. I've seen a lot of these down to division and regimental level, all the achievements, all the campaigns, all of it. This was the payoff. And, it's an interesting point, but in a way, it's beside the point. Patton was the Army commander, maybe the best Army commander in Europe. I think that Brad was a very good Army commander. Not as great as others, but good, solid. Same as a Corps commander. Same as an Army group commander. Not great, good. Maybe even very good.
But, sorry to interrupt there, but the legacy we have, I live in Normandy. I'm in one of my friends who had lunch with us or drink with us this afternoon, he was driving the Avranches area Cobra yesterday and what have you, is that I was telling you before we went live earlier, there's the monument to Bradley at the start line of Cobra, and I checked, and it's got a spelling mistake. It says D.N. Bradley as opposed to O.N. Bradley, and it's a rather understated little stone monument that hasn't got very good parking. You can't really get it. You can easily drive past it and not see it. And then in Avranches, you've got this frankly biggest monument in Normandy to Patton and the Third Army with the big triangle. Then I'm not knocking it. It's a fantastic monument. And there is the arrow off towards Brittany, the arrow off towards Le Mans, the arrow off to this, that, and the other, and Patton there. And I think it's a maybe unique monument because it's talking about the next chapter rather than the chapter that's concluded. Whereas monuments generally are, what has just happened on this ground. But the Cobra one to Bradley is at the beginning of the battle. So before it's, in fact, at the time when we just said, when it's not actually working very well, that bit near the start line where you have the friendly fire and the bombing isn't perfect. And at the end of Operation Cobra, Avranches isn't necessarily the exact end of Operation Cobra, but it kind of is a chapter turn. You have that talking about the as we can see on that map there in front of us, the arrows going off in every single direction there. And I think that Monument Avranches is a bit misleading because it doesn't give any credit to Bradley. Yes, it does mention Lawton Collins. It does mention Middleton in brief on the panel there. So do you think generally, Steve, us historians and interested people about Normandy kind of gloss over Bradley's role in this? And what do you think he brought to Cobra that was exceptional?
Well, I don't think there's any question about what you just said. I will say that neither of us are academics, but there is a lot of work now done on war and society in warfare, rather than bullets, bandages, beans, and so on, battles, bugles. And the whole concept of memorialization. Also, you are rare because you live on the ground and it's covered with monuments. I've followed in Rose's footsteps from where he came ashore all the way to where he was killed. I was able to do that. Incredible when you see that along the way, and all the markers that are there. No, I would say that Bradley gets almost no credit, not only about Cobra now, because now the discussion is much more technical and it's much more a military history discussion rather than a biographical discussion. But when it is a biographical discussion, I'd have to say that Patton gets entirely too much credit. He did virtually nothing in Normandy, zero. Avranches was a great moment, but that was Eighth Corps, basically. And the idea of memorialization over time, shifting from glorifying the dead to some greater notion, like in the American Civil War, of which I know something, and the evolution of memorials and monuments. It changes over time. It's political as much as anything else. And the idea, and we see that now with, renaming things in America, taking down monuments to the Great Patriotic War in those old Soviet states in the middle of a new crisis. These are not purely historical decisions. And I think maybe when they put up that monument, they needed to know what was going to go forward. Even then. So I'm not surprised, but I think you're right. It's an overglorification of what actually happened.
And we got a question there. Who made the decision to put Patton in command of Third Army?
That's a great question. There are a lot of questions like that are hard to nail down. Certainly it had to come, and I'm sure that it was George Marshall who passed on it. I don't know the actual rules within G1 in the American Army for how that actually happens. It absolutely required Bradley's approval, but I'm not so sure that he would have picked Patton.
That came up in the sidebar earlier that would Bradley have chosen Patton for that is, it's interesting. But
probably also Leslie McNair before he was killed.
Leslie McNair is often cited. In fact, that came up in the show about McNair, is that he was earmarked for a higher position of some kind. What that would have been, we won't able to know. But we should move on a bit and conclude the Normandy and Bradley's career and what you think is remembered for. So let's go.
Right. Well, let's move through these really quick because I want to concentrate on the meat. We know what happens in the next 6 weeks: the drive to the Seine and Paris, and then afterwards the great challenge here. I think in the next slide, which is the Bulge. And I'd love to talk about that sometime from the point of view of the highest command level. But we see here what happened, and it was a crisis. It was the lowest point in Bradley's life. Not only that, when Eisenhower took away the First Army, and you could see why, his communications were shattered. There was absolutely no justifiable reason that he could have used, but it was a blow, and he never recovered, and he was pissed. And he said so violently to Eisenhower. He said the kind of words that you can't take back. And it broke their relationship. Now, it didn't end his command, but it maybe can be seen most dramatically in the fact that George Marshall thought the highest of two men, Eisenhower and Bradley. He wanted them to lead the post-war world. And Bradley started out by leading the post-war world, under Harry Truman. And that in itself is again, a World War II historian runs into a lot of trouble when he tries to talk about what happened after the war. And I took a lot of grief on that, even though I thought it was important to describe Bradley's career, first in the VA and then as first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But the fact is that after that, after Eisenhower was elected, it's not like Bradley had any great jobs in the administration. And he was the same age as Eisenhower. And he had had an incredible career. It didn't happen. And I think that's why.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And yeah, well, we'll keep on moving.
Yep. And that was followed again by a resumption of the war. It was bloody. 18,000 Americans killed. An outrage. Horrendous. But it ground on. And I think it reached its peak here in the closing of the Ruhr Pocket, which was named by the British newspapers, frankly, in honor of the fallen commander of then the 3rd Armored Division, Maurice. 250,000 German soldiers. The commander of Army Group B, which had been Bradley's opponent, not Patton's opponent, but Bradley's opponent, Walter Model, committed suicide. His son was killed in this encirclement battle. This was a monumental triumph, the greatest encirclement battle in American history. And followed, as we see here, this is a good illustration of what war does to a man. The left is Rose as chief of staff of the 3rd, or right after he was chief of staff, right after he took over 3rd Armored Division. And then you see him at a award ceremony, photographed in March. You can just see it in his face. And I think we're getting close to the end here. This was the payoff, liberation of death camps. Eisenhower made it a standing order that all senior commanders should visit these camps so that nobody could say it didn't happen. He ordered the newsmen to create visual images which still haunt us. The images in particular in Britain around VE Day of bulldozers at Belsen concentration camp every year. I've been there, I've seen it. These are the images even now that we reference when we talk about this. And then again, they pass through, and here's the victors. Bradley, Eisenhower, his Army commanders, the Air Force commanders, all of them. Of course, Patton wearing a helmet. And that brings us to the end of the war, the meeting at the Elbe with I think it was the first Ukrainian front. Later on, Bradley's second wife wanted to do a TV show and recreate this exact image. Talk about that a bit if we can. And that, I think, takes us to the end of World War II. Bradley thought he'd get some great job like the others, governing Bavaria, Patton, Mark Clark, governing Austria, and so on. Instead, Truman called him back to lead the VA. Bradley didn't even know what the VA was, but 16 million Americans were going to come back from the war. That's 4 times the number of veterans that were alive. And these programs had a direct impact on my life. My father had a low interest mortgage on the GI Bill in the house I grew up in, and all my cousins, the same thing. The new VA hospitals bucked the trend to go with pork barrel legislation to benefit congressional districts. He ruled that every new hospital would have to be built in a major university center. And finally, he opened up the American educational system to people beyond just the upper class. And I definitely benefited by that.
And that goes back to what you said right at the beginning about his upbringing and his kind of dislike or mistrust of the aristocracy and the upper classes, that he brings it back. And, I asked you when we did our comms test earlier about what would Bradley want to be remembered for today. And I would guess from what I've read in your book, others, that things like the GI Bill and those kind of involvements and helping with fairness and equality are probably things he'd rather be remembered for than perhaps a decision he made in July 44 or September 44, whatever it would be. It was a long-term legacy for improvement after the war.
I don't think there's any question. He said that out loud, that nothing gave him more satisfaction. And he did go visit these hospitals and see the wounded people. Also, we'll see later on, I think in the slides next slide or the one after that. He went on to, in retirement, as chairman of the Bulge Watch Corporation, which did incredible work in prosthetics, early work in artificial limbs. He took incredible pride in that. I want to end this. I know it's gone on, but just briefly, his post-war career was what every ground soldier dreams of up until the establishment of the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chief of Staff of the Army. That was it, the pinnacle of the Army career. He succeeded Eisenhower, as Truman had promised him when he took this job, which he thought was going to be a lousy job, but turned out to be, maybe on the top 3 of his legacy, lasting legacy. And then first chairman of the Joint Chiefs for the first major war of the Cold War and the first non-victory after World War II. The Korean War ended in a truce negotiated by Mark Clark at the end, or he was sitting in that chair. But that was a watershed event also. And then, as I said, he retired. And I think that that takes us, except to the predominant image. I talked earlier about Ernie Pyle and the GI image. And the movie Patton pretty much solidified that. You think you know everything about Patton. He's a quiet, deliberative guy. You need that when you have the near maniacal genius leader who might be willing to do things that go outside the book while preaching the book, and so on. This movie, though, has its own interesting backstory. The producer had been George Marshall's secretary, took Bradley's job. So it bears that stamp. Now, we don't have time to get into this, but Bradley married right within a year after his first wife died to a twice divorced Hollywood screenwriter named Kitty Bueller. And she negotiated a deal with McCarthy, the secretary, then actually Brigadier General in the reserves, that they would be the military advisors to the movie for 10% of the gross revenues. It was one of the most successful movies in history, 11 Academy Awards, huge box office. It is Bradley, who had been, comfortable as a retired general officer, was into the ponies, got into that, gambling through Kitty and through his natural personality, as we've been saying all along. They became wealthy, fabulously wealthy, and a part of the Beverly Hills circuit. That's how he ended up. So people who think that he was a stodgy, bland character, there was like a secret swinger out there. Anyway, that's, I think, where
we're learning. Again, with just briefly, I want to talk about the movie, then we'll open it up to questions. A couple of good ones I want to ask. But we always talk about the long-lasting impression we all have of Patton from the movie Patton, and that we all now, when we read a Patton speech, we read it in George C. Scott's voice in our head, not General Patton's real voice. But I think we forget that it also left us a lasting impression of what Bradley was like. It is a two-hander, that film. It's called Patton, but it would have just as easily been called Patton and Bradley, or The Odd Couple. It was that Bradley, in his Carl Malden, is as essential to that movie as George C. Scott as Patton. And I think we all overlook how much of our impressions of Bradley we take from that movie. As you say, it was a huge movie then. It was still a huge movie now. It's still available on all these sources there, and it's left us with a legacy. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's just left us with that legacy.
Well, I don't choose that word image lightly. It's real. There's no question about it. And it's ironic that my next book is also about a character who was made in a movie. Cast a giant shadow. So I don't want to get into trouble, but deconstructing images for the good and the bad while reaffirming what is of value is the point here. And it's a never-ending process, as I'm sure the questions will reflect. So finally, these are some of the things I took away from my work. First, the importance of professional military education. It just cannot be overemphasized. Not just the meat itself, which changes over time as doctrine and so on changes, technology, but the professional context, and most important, Fortuna. chance encounters, these people that I've cited along the way as characters in almost a novel-like story, when you think about it, the greatest war in history. That's crucial. Second, the fact that Bradley's real rise here began as a liaison. And the fact that I basically lived as a liaison when I was writing this book at Bradley's headquarters. That's how I tried to see it. I read all their reports. I read everything I could get my hands on. That and the guys who handled Ultra and the guys who handled Phantom, which is a British invention. Basically listening to your own radio communication so that you can expedite stuff. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Third, don't change a winning routine. I spent a lot of time, particularly in the part of the book about when Bradley took over 12th Army Group. Remember, there were no Army groups. I mean, they talked about that in schools. And in the First World War, they sort of did that. Not really, though. And in the Civil War, yeah, they combined some armies, but there was no Army group. Bradley created that, and he looked to Harold Alexander as a model. I've established that, I think. Very important. And everything that he did, everything he set up, his routine, he changed in the Battle of the Bulge. He didn't go back quickly. He didn't react quickly. He didn't find out that Courtney Hodges had probably had a nervous breakdown and was basically, it was the staff at First Army running the war. Don't change a winning routine. And then we've talked about evaluation in terms of legacy. I mean, the man was the last and youngest of the 9 Americans who wore 5 stars. He was the only one named after World War II, except for Hap Arnold, who is unique because he was a general officer in both the Army and the Air Force. But that's unique in and of itself. And that was a payoff, frankly, by Harry Truman for what he had done for him. Again, that relationship should be looked at to plumb further. But finally, the real legacy may be after World War II, the VA. And now we see clearly how important the first occupant of an office like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs really is. Because we're in the middle of, in this country, in political debate of a ferocious nature, which has recently extended into the chief, the highest uniformed officer in the United States, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Yeah.
That, I think, will bear further comment, and people will come back and look at Bradley, who are doing work in that area.
Super.
And with that, I want to stop.
With that, we'll do questions. So I'm going to scroll back and find a couple of ones that drew my attention. The Great Dominion is asking, any comments about Bradley's famous solid shoulder, broken neck statement regards the closure of the Falaise Gap?
That's hard. The Falaise Gap is hard. Very early in his assumption of Army Group Command, he'd already had to kind of bring back Patton from Brittany in a dispute over authority. He had been working really well with Montgomery, but I think it was too soon for him to push it. I have had a lot of arguments with this, and I think there were also changes of command going on as well, and there were attachments and reattachments that had stemmed from Mortain. But it's also fair to say that Bradley had been thinking about a pretty broad encirclement even before Mortain. So I think that, simple answers are hard here. It is also true that the Air Force pounded the crap out of the Germans who were still retreating. But the fact remains that the headquarters elements of the 7th German Army and the organic operational units did retreat to the Siegfried Line. And that was bad. It was a killing ground in Falaise, but it didn't end until, frankly, I think, till Rose and 7th Corps turned in the Great Mons encirclement battle.
The Mons, yeah. And Anthony Tucker-Jones said the similar thing last week in Falaise about, yes, the Falaise is a victory, but a lot of senior German commanders got out. A lot of the brains and the senior personnel within some of the armor divisions got out and were able to rebuild. And it coincided with the Germans on a kind of a peak of tank production, and actually, didn't break the German army in the complete way it could have done. But that going into the Falaise Gap again is another rabbit hole. But another question for you. which could also be a rabbit hole, but we'll ask anyways. K9 Man Trailing is saying, can you ask him Bradley's views on Vietnam?
Good question. There's a Life magazine article about Bradley visiting Vietnam, again, that his wife arranged through her contacts. He was straight, down the line. We need to be there. We need to fight. He was part of a group that LBJ got together called the Grand Old Men, or the Gray Heads, or whatever, along with old diplomats. And they pretty much, held to the party line. He was no anti-war critic, let's put it that way. But nobody cared. Nobody cared.
And there's one from Stephen Bork here somewhere. His relationship with Montgomery. We kind of talked about his relationship with Patton, and obviously with the caveat that everybody's relationship with Montgomery is to some extent tricky, because Montgomery doesn't do people very well, and that's another discussion of the day. But and Stephen Bork, I said it in the comments, but I loved your latest book on the D-Day bombing. And if you haven't got Stephen Bork's new book, it's the Osprey series of about the failure of the Allied bombing on D-Day. Go and get it, folks. It's really amazing. And then go back and watch the show with Stephen Bork about 6 months ago, but more than that, about the bombing on D-Day. But anyway, Bradley's relationship with Montgomery. We just hinted at it with Falaise, but generally.
I'm not going to let you be the only one to praise Stephen Bork. I want to say hello to him and how much I appreciate his comradeship. Good question. I'd say Patton's a pretty good model. There was a lot of respect, but it blew up. I mean, it blew up during the Bulge in a personal meeting, which I describe in my biography. Montgomery, I don't think it's unfair to say, had a tendency to talk down to people. He did that with people that he didn't think were his equal, and I think he did that with Bradley at the wrong time on more than one occasion. On the other hand, it's also fair to say that they worked pretty well together in Normandy in particular, when Bradley was his subordinate. And that's also interesting because that worked with Patton as well, as subordinate and superior. In fact, that's another example. But I would call it distant, hostile. I think that Bradley didn't like the British particularly. That was the way he was brought up. And he didn't ever find any common ground. One of my favorite stories is Drew Middleton, who was the military correspondent of the New York Times and knew all these guys as a young journalist. He didn't like the British either. But when he got over there, he started hanging out in the pubs, and he saw that the British were, fanatical about the sports that they liked, rugby or soccer or cricket. And he found common ground that way. Bradley never found common ground. He did with Freddie, I should say he did with Freddie de Guignan, who was Montgomery's chief of staff. They were both fishermen, and they got along great. And maybe that is part of what we were talking about earlier, staff level relationships.
Yeah, and his staff seem to work together with other staffs very well. And I think I'm not going to judge anybody for not being able to get on very well with Montgomery, because I don't think I'd better get on very well with Montgomery. I don't think many people I know would find Montgomery easy to get on with. And as Brad said from On This Day in Canadian Military History, I think Monty's relationship with Monty was difficult. I think, that probably is it. And in a nutshell, I don't think he knows himself. I don't think he probably likes himself, Montgomery. He's very difficult as a human being. I mean, this is separate, of course, to his ability as a commander of 21st Army Group. But
anyone who knows what happened to his family and the personal tragedy that he suffered, in a way, I would think that would be crushing. But in a way, it reminds me of Pershing, who lost virtually his entire family at a fire at the Presidio in San Francisco when he was off doing something else, and then went on to be appointed the head of the Allied Expeditionary Force. So personal difficulty, yes, I think it shaped him.
Yeah. Well, this last question seems like it's an obvious and a simple one, but actually I think it's quite an important one to finish on. Tom Grimsley is asking, do you think Bradley is a good general? And it seems a bit simplistic, but actually it's a valid question, because we quantify what is meant by the word good. I mean, I said to you before we went live, that the idea of he's considered, the term has come out as steady and plays the averages and not exciting, not showy. And you could say that that's a compliment or negative. But was he a good general? What's your feedback to that, Steve?
Well, I think it is a good question. It gets us to look at words that we take for granted, like good. And there are a lot of ways to ask the question. Was he a great captain? I'm not sure. But one thing is certain. He was successful. He was the most important of the Army group commanders, leading the largest and most important field army in American history, maybe one of the largest field armies in all of history. I'm not sure about Russian fronts and how to measure that. But success, not good, bad, indifferent. Maybe competent would be another word that I would use. Very competent. We talked about this earlier when we talked about how to evaluate a commander, generally against other commanders or in their jobs at the time and so on. So, yes, I guess I'd come back to it and say, yes, I think he was a good general.
Yeah, no, I think I'm with you. I mean, it's over the years, we will bring this to an end in a minute, folks, is that, his reputation hasn't been hammered like some people has, but neither has he been over celebrated. He's kind of stayed, I would think, fairly kind of level through the 80 years of study. There's other generals in history. I'm thinking Robert E. Lee, Napoleon, Montgomery himself, who've gone up to be overly celebrated and crashing right down. But Bradley kind of has always been there in that kind of mid area without ever being, disappearing from that level there. And I think maybe he'd be kind of happy with that, just somewhere remembered, but maybe not with much hostility or maybe not much affection either, just remembered.
And he is remembered. He was one of the names that came up a lot in this renaming of American installations away from Confederates to more generally accepted heroes. And I think that might still happen. It's an ongoing process. But more than that, I think what you said actually opened it up for me because of what you just said. He wasn't overly studied. He wasn't overly criticized. Everybody figured they, as a result of the movie, as much as anything else, figured they had the mark of the man. They understood sort of what he did and what he should be given credit for, but not really looking at it the way we've been describing each of his jobs at each juncture. And I think I just saw a comment go by, which I agree with completely. Rare, great captains, rare. I mean,
yeah, and when you have a career as long as Bradley did, it's kind of averages out. The peaks and the troughs are going to kind of be lost a bit. The generals we think of, particularly as being brilliant or awful, are the ones that tended to have one maybe quite brief, really, really pivotal campaign that they either came out of brilliantly or they came out of disastrously. But when you place someone's career over a longer period, it all averages itself out. And like a lot of the other commanders, like Dempsey, for example, Dempsey doesn't particularly have any massive highs or massive lows because he was there for a long time. Alexander, we talked about earlier, again, another career that kind of is steady. And I think that's ultimately is long lasting, is in itself a skill, isn't it? Just to be there at the beginning and be there at the end is something that a lot of generals didn't survive. That we've talked about some casualties who were lost along the way in terms of just being sacked. There's in the British Army, there's Bucknell and other figures who just get pushed out completely. So still being there at the end is recognition that you're all right, and all right is okay. All right is good. It's like when, as a Brit, if someone a restaurant, they say they give me the meal and they come up at the end and say, was that good? And, yeah, it was all right. Yeah, it was good. Yeah. That's high praise in some ways. It's just, yeah, fine. It was okay. So we've come to an end now. So, Steve, it's become clear that I need to have you come back again, either to do a deeper dive on Bradley, perhaps in the Ardennes, or we look at one of your other subjects, or Maurice Rose is another subject. So if you're happy to come back at some point in the future, that would be great. If you're up for that.
I enjoyed it tremendously. Love talking to you. Sorry if I went over. I guess
no, it's fine. People are still there. They're still watching. It's great. So and folks, sorry for the tricky start there, but we got there in the end. So I'm just gonna take you off screen for a second and bring you back in a second. So folks, another double bill tomorrow. No rest for the wicked. So 10 o'clock UK time in the morning. Nigel Askey's coming on for the final part of our incredible look at the Soviets casualty rates in World War II. Incredible analysis of data. If you look at the show listing and it sounds to you, it doesn't sound like your sort of thing. It probably will be when you start watching it. There's a guy who has a grasp of how data and figures and data streams work, and I have found it absolutely fascinating. So that's tomorrow at 10 a.m. UK time, and then the evening 7 p.m. UK time, Wendy Goldman is coming on to conclude Eastern Front Week, and we're looking at the Soviet civilian experience, particularly the massive rebuilding of the factory network further to the east, away from the German advance. That will be really fascinating. Her book that came out, I think this year or last year, is one of those sort of game changers for me. So that's tomorrow, 2 shows tomorrow, and then nothing Friday. Got Friday and then the weekend off, then back on Monday. So I'm going to bring Steve back in to say thank you very much. And we got there in the end. It was worth, like all good things, it was worth waiting for. And we got there, third time's a charm. We got there, one delay, then a stream that didn't work, and there we are. So it all worked out brilliantly. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
So this is Paul Woodhouse from World War II TV. I was saying I will see you all again for another double bill tomorrow. Cheers. Thank you for your diligence and your commitment to watching all these streams. Thanks, everybody. Bye.